New Thomas Sowell fans should read his books on economics first by Spencer Antonio Marlen-Starr, originally published July 17th, 2023 on Medium. In this article, I will review Thomas Sowell's most influential, that is, non-academic books, explain how they helped me change my worldview over several years, which was a painful process to go through in real time, how they helped shape my understanding of economics early on, and suggest an optimal order for reading these books based on my personal experience and the complexity of the concepts they cover. Thesis. Many of Thomas Sowell's books, particularly Basic Economics, serve as essential reading material for any person seeking a better understanding of how the world works, because the economy is such a huge factor in everyone's life. While his other books, such as Black Rednecks and White Liberals, may also be thought-provoking and insightful, they could be overwhelming or, more importantly, off-putting to individuals unfamiliar with Sowell's ideas and his writing style. Therefore, the strategic reading order, starting with basic economics and gradually progressing to more complex works like Knowledge and Decisions, allows would-be readers to grasp sound economic principles before delving into contentious socio-political topics. This approach is crucial as it highlights the lack of fundamental economic knowledge among both right-wing and left-wing individuals, thereby fostering a better informed and intellectually grounded public discourse. Why should you listen to me? That's a great question. Who am I to tell you the optimal order in which to read the books of one of the true intellectual giants of the 20th and 21st centuries? Well, it would be safe to call me a Thomas Sowell aficionado and megafan, for I have listened to the audio versions of all of the following books of his: Basic Economics 2 or 3 times, Applied Economics twice, Wealth, Poverty, and Politics 3 times, Marxism, Economics and Philosophy 2 times, Economic Facts and Fallacies 2 times, Knowledge and Decisions 3 or 4 times, Conflict of Visions twice, Black Rednecks and White Liberals 2 or 3 times, Discrimination and Disparities twice, Civil Rights, Rhetoric or Reality 1 time so far. By my count, that makes 10 of his books, and I am currently listening to Intellectuals and Society for the first time. Edit. Having now finished Intellectuals and Society, I can report back that it is fantastic. Next section. I started out with Basic Economics, and so should you. In my opinion, some amount of Sowell's work is must-read material for anyone who wants to understand the world economically, sociologically, and politically. I first began listening to the audio version of his books within a few months of my first smartphone when I was just 18 back in 2013. Basic Economics was one of the first few books I bought on Audible. I dreamed of becoming an economist at the time. Currently, I do have a bachelor's in economics, and I was the only peer tutor in the subject of economics at my community college after getting A's in both principles of microeconomics and macroeconomics until I transferred to my four-year university. And this masterpiece taught me the subject matter better than any textbook ever could. That is Basic Economics again. The main comparative advantage that I noticed when reading Basic Economics was how many fascinating examples Sowell uses from the Soviet economy to show you, the reader, what happens in the absence of market forces, which for me was more illuminating in terms of how well markets work than examples of what happens in well-functioning market systems. As I was writing this article right now, I just had some curiosity, so I pulled open my PDF copy of the fourth edition of Basic Economics, the version I read, and just did a simple Control F search and found 172 mentions of Soviet within it versus only a single mention of Soviet in Hal Varian, Google's chief economist, popular Intermediate Microeconomics with Calculus, the textbook we used in my upper division microeconomics courses at UC Irvine. Many of these examples come from the work of two Soviet economists, Nikolai Shmelev and Vladimir Popov. I could extol the virtues of basic economics at much greater length here, but the thesis of this article would not be much served by that indulgence were I to allow it. After listening to basic economics twice, I listened to applied economics. Then, knowledge and decisions. We'll come back to that book later. Then, wealth, poverty, and politics. And then either a conflict of visions, which, by the way, is Sowell's favorite of his own books, or Marxism, philosophy and economics, or black rednecks and white liberals. Which of those three was the fifth of his books I read in order is not so much important as the fact that none of them were the first, and that is how it should be. Here's the thing. I hope and dreamed as I was younger that one day the world would find out about Dr. Sowell in the form of millions of young people around 18 or so in the United States would begin to become acquainted with his thoughts and ideas as I had at that age. And I finally did get my wish within the last few years. However, most of the videos I have seen cut into clips that are getting millions of views are about some of the most contentious socio-political and or historical or cultural topics imaginable. They're often from his books like Black Rednecks and White Liberals, which is an amazing book, and I fully stand behind it. But if you had shown me Black Rednecks and White Liberals back when I first read Basic Economics, at a time when I was still mid transition from left wing to classical liberal, and unsure of my views and convictions, I likely would not have believed his stance or gotten such a negative gut feeling reaction to some of the things I learned in that book that it may have cut off my journey right then and there. I really do believe that is a legitimate thing that could have happened to me, not just hyperbole. I cannot emphasize how hard it is to almost get past the moral gag reflex a lifelong leftist has when it comes to certain topics that they, or in this case I, was either uninformed or misinformed on. As a mixed brown, moreno person, I have a Mexican father and a white American mother, uh, child, I distinctly even remember becoming physically uncomfortable just listening to certain small subsections of applied economics, talking about unassimilated and non assimilating communities in France from the Middle East and problems they had already been causing. That is one reason I don't think it is wise to recommend really explosive books like Black Rednecks and White Liberals to a friend who is on the political left who has never read any of Sowell's books before. Another reason which I believe is even more important is that a decent or even rudimentary understanding of sound economics is not innate among human beings, unfortunately. Let us, fans of Thomas Sowell, not forget that he is first and foremost an economist. That is his wheelhouse. That is where he truly shines. And crucially, most conservative, right-wing, and/or Republican Americans today in the 2020s are just as sorely lacking in their knowledge of basic economic principles as are their counterparts on the opposite end of the political spectrum. To take just a simple example that I think illustrates this off the top of my head, Florida recently passed a $15 minimum wage rate via statewide ballot initiative, and it was not close despite it being a red state now. The minimum wage is the second most agreed upon public policy among all professional economists in the United States, and it has been for well over half a century now. P.S. I've published a lengthy review of the professional economic literature on minimum wage laws elsewhere on my Medium blog, if you want to know what the basis of this agreement rests upon and go over the history of the literature. Anyways, the only public policy with more unanimous disapproval from economists is international trade. Dot dot dot. Wait for it. Wait for it. Thank God Republicans would never turn against open markets, open trade, international trade, and shift towards tariffs and quotas again, though. That would be a travesty. Two quotes which are within a page of each other in Chapter 10 of Basic Economics that I would say are representative of Sowell's position on the minimum wage are the following. Quote, a majority of professional economists surveyed in Britain, Germany, Canada, Switzerland, and the United States agreed that minimum wage laws increase unemployment among low skilled workers. Economists in France and Austria did not. However, the majority among Canadian economists was 85%, and among American economists was 90%. Dozens of studies of the effects of minimum wages in the United States and dozens more studies of the effects of minimum wages in various countries, such as European countries, Latin America, the Caribbean, Indonesia, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, were reviewed in 2006 by two economists at the National Bureau of Economic Research. They concluded that despite the various approaches and methods used in these studies, this literature as a whole was one largely solidifying the conventional view that minimum wages reduce employment among low skilled workers. End of quote. It must be said here that starting in the 1990s, the consensus among economists and among studies done by economists on the minimum wage began falling below the 80-ish% agreement in terms of the opinions of economists and the almost unanimous research literature up to that point. Here's what Sowell says about those studies, the most influential and famous of which are covered in my aforementioned Medium article on minimum wages. Quote, even though most studies show that unemployment tends to increase as minimum wages are imposed or increased, those few studies that seem to indicate otherwise have been hailed in some quarters as having, quote, refuted this myth, unquote. However, one common problem with research on the employment effects of minimum wage laws is that surveys of employees before and after a minimum wage increase can survey only those particular businesses which survived in both periods. Given the high rates of business failures in many industries, the results for the surviving businesses may be completely different from the results of the industry as a whole. End of quote. Another wholly unrelated topic on which Sowell is a much needed corrective given the voluminous nonsense said about the topic by others for decades is the topic of so-called income inequality in the United States. I'm referring to those who discuss this topic by talking about various quintiles of Americans by household income in one year versus some other year, as is typical. Here's the gaping problem with this methodology, according to Uncle Thomas. Quote, people do not live on percentage shares, they live on real income. Among those individuals who were in the bottom 20% of all income earning households in the United States in 1975, 98% had higher real incomes by 1991, and two-thirds of them had higher real incomes than the average American had back in 1975. End of quote. The figures Sowell quotes here are from individual tax returns from the United States Treasury Department, not from household income data found in the Census Bureau's current population survey. Next section. My ideal Sowell reading order out of the 11 of his books which I've already read. The first three to start out with. I have already recommended that you should start out your book reading journey with basic economics. After that, I would recommend either economic facts and fallacies or applied economics. But truthfully, I would actually recommend a shorter book from the 19th century written by an amazing French economist called That Which Is Seen and That Which Is Not Seen. It's by Frédéric Bastiat, by the way. And there's a free audio version of it available on YouTube at this link. As a substitute for applied economics, because they both follow from the same theme, and that which is seen and that which is not seen is much shorter. Then after those, I would recommend Wealth, Poverty, and Politics as your third book. Sowell's greatest book, in my opinion. After those three, I think you will have earned your ability to read his juicier and more infamous, at least in some circles, works. However, I would strongly recommend that at some point in your life, if you really do appreciate this great man, you try to read what in my mind is his magnum opus, Knowledge and Decisions, 1980. Sowell has written somewhere between 20 and 50 books by now, so from time to time an interviewer has asked him which of his books is his favorite. And when this happens, he always answers a conflict of visions. That is also a fantastic book, don't get me wrong. I put it right up there with The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt and The Three Languages of Politics by Arnold Kling as the three quintessential books anyone who wants to understand why people persist in their political disagreements over the years and decades without having to resort to calling them stupid or evil. That being said, Knowledge and Decisions is almost unparalleled in modern social science and social theory. It is a book length expansion and elaboration on F.A. Hayek's landmark 1945 paper, The Use of Knowledge in Society, which helped him win his Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in honor of Alfred Nobel in 1974. Hayek very much approved of Knowledge and Decisions when it came out in 1980, roughly 12 years before Hayek died. This book deservedly won the 1980 Law and Economics Center Prize as well. To get an idea of just how much Hayek approved of this landmark contribution, he called his review of said book the best book on general economics in many a year. Below, I include a paragraph in full from that review. However, I chose this specific paragraph rather arbitrarily, as there are many other paragraphs from this review which were just as glowing. Quote, "It does not unduly simplify, but exceeds in being intelligible to the attentive reader. Nobody can make these things quite easy, but the clarity and precision of Professor Sowell's exposition is exemplary. I so much approve and admire the argument of the book that I find myself concerned more with whether it explains those important insights as effectively as possible than with its originality and correctness, although it is rich in both of these also. Professor Sowell is unusually careful and precise with his language. I may sometimes hesitate about the terminology that he chooses, but that presumably is more familiar to a younger generation. For example, incremental rather than marginal, trade-off, authentication, fungibility, referral, incumbent, sequential, etc. These may well be better terms than those we had to use in the past, and in various other circumstances where I at first wish that something were put more concisely, I usually find that I do not really know how that could be done." End of quote. In other words, there are not very many books like Knowledge and Decisions written by anyone at any time, and should you choose to study it, it will not be light reading, for the subjects and concepts covered are too far away from simple to be made simple. But Sowell does a better job than the legendary economist whose work it is based off of says he ever could. I also published the review of Knowledge and Decisions I wrote on my Goodreads profile as a brief standalone article here on my Medium blog elsewhere, so feel free to check that out if you want to know a bit more, or if you want me to read that and upload it to YouTube as well. After slogging your way through this epic tome twice, then I would recommend reading Sowell's favorite of his own books, A Conflict of Visions. The reason it is his favorite, according to him, is because it is his most original work. It seeks to understand and explain why those who are ideologically on the left and right, at least in the United States, cannot convince one another, and why you can reliably predict someone's views on gun control are if you know their views on abortion and income taxes. Three things that are seemingly unrelated, at least on the surface. After the aforementioned books, it's up to you to decide. After you have studied A Conflict of Visions, then, in my humble opinion, you have earned the right to dive into his more contentious books, full of hot takes such as The Vision of the Anointed, The Quest for Cosmic Justice, Black Rednecks and White Liberals, etc. The best of the books he has written in this broad category which I have read is Intellectuals in Society. But hey, people are entitled to their own tastes and preferences, so my favorite might not be yours. The end.